Thank you. Director Rabe, as we keep talking about China, and this takes off on what Senator Risch has already asked, using the academic community and the universities, commercial espionage, the forced transfer of intellectual property, embedding themselves potentially into the supply chain, obviously traditional counterintelligence work that they do and the like. Is it not fair to say that China today poses, just looking at the scale and scope of the threat, that China today poses the most significant counter this nation has faced, perhaps in its history, but certainly in the last quarter to century?
Well, I hesitate to speak, categorically about the entire course of history, but I certainly would.
Well, let's limit it to 25 years.
But I would certainly agree with you, Senator, that as I look at the landscape today and over the course of my career, I still think of myself as a little bit young, that the Chinese counterintelligence threat is more deep, more diverse, more vexing, more challenging, more comprehensive, and more concerning than any counterintelligence threat I can think of.
And in that realm, would it not make sense, and perhaps this is for you, Director Coates, that we would have a more coordinated approach to educate and prepare all the departments and agencies of government, as well as businesses, universities, I mean, just the scale and comprehensive nature of the threat? Would it not make sense to have some high-level coordination or a coordinated approach to be able to prepare all these different entities in our economy and society to deal with this threat?
We are working carefully with the committee, particularly Senator Warner and Senator Burr both have engaged with us in terms of putting a program together to do just that. I turn to General Ashley for his comments on it also.
So the fact that we're having this discussion and that you've illuminated that, and even last year we talked about the Confucius Institutes, that word gets out. Since 2014, 13 universities have closed down the Confucius Institutes. U.S.-wide, I think the number's about 100. But again, my previous comment in terms of this is a global issue, while we've closed down about 13 in the U.S., there's been about a 23% increase globally in Asia, Europe, and other places, and there's probably about 320-plus institutes that exist globally. So the education is getting out from a U.S. standpoint, and it's trending the right way slowly. But again, it is a global problem, and we're as weak as the relationships with some of those partners subject to influence.
Well, this is now where I make the obligatory pitch. Senator Warner and I have filed a bill that creates an Office of Critical Technologies to help coordinate the response to this threat across the board. And so, and I know everybody in this committee is interested in this topic. I want to switch gears for a moment and maybe ask you this, Director Coates, as well. If we look at the situation in Venezuela, which usually I raise in this committee, and people know it's important, but now it's really topical. So we've had 3 million migrants flow primarily into Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. It's projected to be 5 million if current trends continue by the end of this year, that would be a rival number to what we've seen in the Syria situation, and it most certainly has had a destabilizing effect on Colombia and other neighboring countries, to the point where some of these nations, very few nations, could take in 1 million migrants in one shot, not to mention that quickly. Imagine 2 million and the impact it's having on their government budgets, their healthcare systems, and the like. We know from Department of Justice filings and sanctions from Treasury that their government doesn't just tolerate drug trafficking, they give it the protection of government, and many high-level officials are active participants in narco-trafficking. We know that they have a relationship, long-standing relationship with Iran and with Hezbollah. We know they have openly and repeatedly, at least Maduro has, invited the Russians and Putin to establish either a rotational or permanent presence somewhere in Venezuela, thereby creating a Russian military presence in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, they flew about 3 weeks ago or a month ago 2 Russian nuclear-capable bombers into the Caribbean Sea. Seeing all these factors, what's happening in Venezuela, we care a lot about democracy, we care a lot about freedom, we care a lot about human rights. But when you add all these things together, the migratory impact on regional partners and how that spills over into the United States, their relationship with Iran and Hezbollah, the drug trafficking, because all that cocaine is destined to come into our streets, the invitation to the Russians to potentially have a military base, whether it's rotational or permanent in our hemisphere, is it not in the national interest of the United States of America that the Maduro regime fall and be replaced by a democratic and more responsible government?
Well, I think everything you said is been very open to the American public relative to the situation that exists in Venezuela. Our job as an intelligence community is to provide all the relevant information that you just talked about in terms of what the impact of what's happening in Venezuela and then throughout the region and the threat that it evolves from that. The decision as to how to address that obviously is a decision by the executive branch and by the president ultimately, with the support of the National Security Council. We do obviously face a dire situation that has enormous consequences. I think nobody's more aware of that than you. You've been the person we turn to for almost ready to invite you into the intelligence community, given the information that you can provide for us, given your interest. I was remiss in not naming you as someone relative to China as taking a forward effort on the part of the committee and joining us in a number of ways to talk to CEOs and others around the country relative to the Chinese threat. With Venezuela, it's a very tenuous situation right now. As you know, we have taken steps in terms of recognition of the opposition as the legitimate president of Venezuela. Yesterday, the Treasury Department announced oil sanctions against a Venezuelan oil company. They're a major company that we do business with here also. So steps are being taken, and we have a lot of support from a lot of our allies. So, as I said, it's a very fluid situation that I think hopefully will be successfully resolved with the support of the Venezuelan people. And but we do assess, and I'll turn to General Ashley here, the influence of the military on that decision. I think the Venezuelan military on that decision probably is a key to what direction we might go in.
So I would say that everything you laid out is correct. We expect to see another 2 million refugees leave to add to the 3 million that will go into the region. The relationship that they have with Russia, China, and Iran is a longstanding one, pre-existing. The reference you made to the Tu-160 Blackjacks that flew, those strategic bombers, third iteration of that. The first time was in 2008 and then 2014, and we've seen it again. As far as presence on the ground, we can talk a little more detail in a closed session about where we see Russia and China going with that greater instability. But in the open press, what you've seen thus far really is nothing more than just vocal support that's coming out of Moscow and that's coming out of China as well. But there is a relationship there from a military standpoint in the way of training. Lots of Venezuelan officers go to Russia for training, and there's a reciprocal relationship for equipping them as well.